about how a few of us got together to disrupt the Ngioweb Botnet. So really briefly, my name's Chris. I've worked with Lumen's Black Lotus Labs for around 3 to 4 years, always in crime-oriented botnets, so ransomware, DDoS, malicious proxy services, kind of anything that falls in that realm. So just kind of a high-level overview of what we'll talk about today. First, really briefly, we'll just talk about Lumen and Black Lotus Labs and how we can actually disrupt botnets. Then we'll talk about proxy services, and specifically we'll dig into the NSOCKS proxy service. Then we'll kind of move on to how it's actually being powered with the Ngioweb malware. We'll go into a little analysis on it, and then also we'll talk about kind of the botnet architecture. Then hopefully we'll get to the fun part, which is the collaboration with the industry, how we went about disrupting it, and kind of what life looked after our disruption. So really briefly, for anyone who isn't aware of Lumen and Black Lotus Labs, when we think about internet traffic as a whole, whether you're trying to communicate with somebody who's really close to you or maybe a server in another country, at some point that data is going to go across some form of physical wire. And if your ISP that you're using doesn't have a direct route between you and who you're trying to reach out to, they're going to have to peer with another ISP in order to get that traffic to where it needs to go. Lumen's one of the largest ISPs, so we have tons of ISPs that peer with us and that we peer with, so we can see traffic from all over the world. And this allows us to effectively threat hunt through things like seeing source and destination IPs, ports, total amount of traffic being sent, and things like that. What this also helps us with is the ability to do what we call no routing. And no routing is basically if we see a server that we think is very malicious or we don't think people should be interacting with it, we can no route it, basically meaning that anybody who tries to, whether directly in our network, communicate with that server, or someone who's trying to use our network in order to get to that server, will drop that traffic such that it never actually makes it to that server. So this is how we can kind of disrupt botnets at scale. So kind of now that we have that understanding, we can move into proxy services. So specifically, we're just going to focus on residential-based proxy services. So these are non-VPS-based proxy services for the most part. So there's kind of two types. There's benign proxy services and malicious proxy services. So benign proxy services will either lease their IP space directly from an ISP, or they'll generally have incentive programs, maybe apps, but they'll have very clear terms and conditions, exactly how a user's bandwidth is going to be used in the proxy service, and they'll be able to let the users opt in or opt out at any time they'd like. Then we kind of move over to the malicious proxy services, and these are what are infecting victims with malware and creating a botnet, except they're selling this botnet under the cloak of saying that they're a proxy service. The most common infection vectors for these are generally one of three things, either direct exploitation of devices, so you can think of IoT devices, security cameras, easily exploitable, things like that. They'll directly exploit them and add them. Then cracked software is another very popular one. Basically, develop your proxy module, and then you'll just have people add it into any software that they can find. And another very popular one is free apps, generally free VPN apps. And this is, the difference here is these free VPN apps, there's going to be no clear terms or conditions exactly how a user's bandwidth is going to be used. So when you join this free VPN app, you have no idea you're actually joining a proxy service. So whether you're a benign proxy service or a malicious proxy service, there's kind of a few characteristics that'll make either service successful. Number one is having a very large pool of devices in very diverse locations. So you'll have users from all over the place, and a lot of times on the malicious side, they're trying to infect specific organizations, specific countries. So they need devices kind of all over that they can use. The next is having low detection rates in terms of the IPs being detected. So if all of the IPs were easily detected, the proxy service would essentially be useless. The next is a regular addition of fresh new IPs. So you can't have your users using the same IPs every single day. Eventually, it would be easy to catch, and they wouldn't be able to do much with these after a couple days. The final is stability of connection. So a lot of these proxy services, you'll buy a proxy for, say, 24 hours, maybe a day, maybe 2 days. And you need that proxy to stay for that entire time frame. So for example, what happens in a lot of proxy services that don't last long is you'll buy a proxy, and maybe 6 hours later, the IP address is going to change. And then another 6 hours later, the proxy will just go dead. So you paid for 24 hours, but you only got maybe half of that time. As you can imagine, between these benign proxy services and malicious proxy services, there's a ton of gray area in between. It might not fully be a botnet, but it's definitely not benign and clear. So unfortunately, proxy services being powered by botnets is nothing new. Through many years, there's been several, and especially in the last couple of years, there's been a variety of interventions in these services. So one example is the faceless proxy services, which is one of the most famous, had around 30 to 50,000 proxies at any given time. And they were primarily gathering these proxies through using the malware that they called the Moon malware. And this malware would be inserted on devices through direct exploitation. So basically, Netgear devices, ASUS devices, a lot of IoT routers, things like that. What was really interesting about the faceless service is that they actually, on their service, said anybody who could give them an exploit that would infect at least 5,000 devices, they would add to their proxy service. They would actually pay you for it. So this allowed them to have many 0 and 1 day exploits that they were using. So they were quite a powerful proxy service for a while and recently went defunct about 6 months ago or so now. Another really popular proxy service is known as Proxy AM. This regularly has around 100,000 to 200,000 proxies on any given day. And they're primarily infected with the malware known as SOCKS 5 systems. SOCKS 5 systems is, in contrast to how faceless is spread through direct exploitation, SOCKS 5 systems is generally spread through either cracked software, so being packaged in other software, or dropped by loaders such as Amade, Private Loader, Smoke Loader, things like that. But maybe the most famous proxy service there's ever been is the proxy service known as 911S5, which eventually became known as Cloud Router until the Department of Justice took it down. In their report, they said it infected around 19 million devices over its lifetime. It used a few different infection mechanisms. One was through cracked software. It would basically put it in anything that it could get its hands on. And the other had a variety of different free VPN apps. However, all of these free VPN apps had no way of letting the user know they were actually joining a proxy service. It was by far the largest proxy service that's been taken down to date. But kind of moving on to what this will be about is the most interesting one is the NSOCKS proxy service. So NSOCKS officially came around in 2022. However, we have very good proof that it actually operated under the name of LuxSOCKS, going all the way back to 2015. It regularly has around 30 to 40,000 IPs on any given day, and it's in around 180 countries or so, so basically anywhere you'd be interested in, you could find a proxy there. They only accept crypto-based currencies, and they also only market on kind of malicious forums or hacker forums. So when we look at the actual user interface, one of the first things we notice is that it's actually a pretty well done user interface. So you can filter for the IPs that you're looking for based on almost any criteria you can think of: IP, domain, city, state, country, specific ISP. You can see the speed of these proxies. You can see when it was last added, so how recently it is. And then if you look at the price column on the picture on the left all the way on the right, you can see how cheap these proxies are. For just a couple of dollars or a couple of euros a day, you can buy several different proxies, and you can keep rotating these such that you'll be able to stay anonymous very easily. When you actually click to buy one of these proxies, you'll get kind of the view that's on the right, and it's going to be all the same information that you can kind of see here, except it's going to have two more quite interesting things. One is going to be whether or not it's currently seen on any blacklists, so you can easily know if it's going to be easily detected or not. And the second is towards the bottom of the info section, you'll see two different things. One is the DNS column, and this is actually the DNS server that the victim is using. We're not exactly sure why this was so popular of a value for them to include, but as we'll talk about in the malware section, they go out of their way in order to find this value. The next is the one at the bottom where it says usage, 3 to 5 users. The service also lets you know how many users are currently using these proxies. So for example, in this proxy, there's 3 to 5 other people who also bought the same proxy. So this is helpful in the sense of maybe you want to make sure whatever proxy you buy, you're using the full bandwidth, or maybe you want to make sure you're obfuscating your traffic even more, so you'll buy one that other people are also using. So as we were looking into the NSOCKS proxy service, we ran into a really interesting service named Luxury Socks. And if this service sounds familiar, it's because, as I mentioned, the service previously operated under the name of NSOCKS, going back to 2015. So this is likely, when we looked into this service, we found they were selling all the exact same IPs that NSOCKS was selling. So what was likely happening here is the actors were trying to basically get that same market they had from NSOCKS back to their service without directly saying that NSOCKS and NSOCKS were tied together. One of the fascinating parts about luxury socks is that if you look at the price column, these IPs are generally 4 to 5 times more expensive than the proxies and NSOCKS. So depending on which service you were buying from, you might be paying a lot more than the other. So now that we kind of understand the kind of overall proxy service, we can move on into the actual malware that was kind of powering these. So the Ngioweb malware was first officially seen in 2017 by Checkpoint Research. However, we found some files going back to 2015 with the Ngioweb malware. So we actually believe since NSOCKS started in 2015, it's always been powered by the Ngioweb malware, and that's always been the Ngioweb malware sole purpose is to power proxy services. And then real quickly before I go on, there's been a lot of phenomenal research on the Ngioweb malware throughout the years. And kind of without all of that great research, we wouldn't have been able to act kind of as quickly as we could. So definitely encourage people who are interested to check out some great articles on it. So before we kind of dig into each layer of kind of this architecture, we'll just kind of look at a high-level overview of what the actual victim infection pipeline looks like. So in this first layer is what we'll call the loader C2 layer. In this layer, C2s are going to be scanning for exploitable devices that they can find. So they'll be scanning different routers, different security cameras, different things that they can infect. Once they find a victim that's exploitable, they're going to exploit that victim, and they're going to have the victim request malware from the C2. The victim's then going to download that malware, and once they download that malware, they're going to move on to the second layer, which is what we call the DGA layer, C2. So in this layer, the victim's going to quickly, once they run the malware, start running a domain generation algorithm. And once they find an active domain, they're going to maintain a long-term connection to that active domain. We found through our research generally, victims will stay connected to this malware for anywhere around 30 to 40 days on average. Assuming the victim successfully connects to an active DGA domain, they're going to have to pass a couple quick checks, and assuming they pass that, they'll then be passed on to the final layer of this botnet, which is known as the backconnect C2 layer. In this layer, once you successfully connect to this, it's likely where you become officially part of the NSOCKS proxy service. So kind of looking into this first layer, what we call the loader C2 layer, this layer consists of around 20 active C2s at any time. So these C2s are scanning for vulnerable devices, and if they find a vulnerable device, they'll exploit the victim and have it request from either port 80 or port 21 the true Ngioweb malware from the C2. And you can kind of see what that looks like on the picture on the right. You can see the wget command where it's basically having it reach out to a specific server in order to grab the file. It'll then have it run the file, and then it'll immediately delete that file. So of these 20 C2s, we suspect that each C2 is only scanning for a singular exploit. And some of these C2s were actually scanning for the exact same exploit. So we suspect the actor had around 15 or so active exploits at any time. While most of these exploits were quite old and several years old, we found that several of these exploits were likely 1 days or possibly even 0 days at the time they did come out, and the actor would regularly add new exploits. So they were more than capable of not only getting end-of-life devices, but getting more recent devices as well. One final thing to note is if you look at the image kind of at the bottom, so these loader C2s, what we found when we looked into their architecture, they all reported to a singular IP, and we suspected that this IP actually housed the true copies of the malware, and the C2s were merely acting as proxies in order to retrieve it. So for example, if you think of their Netgear exploit that they had, if you were infected with this and you reached out to that C2 would then forward the request to the true malware server in order to grab it. Likely this was used in order to obfuscate the true malware server such that over the years that this server was active, it had never been flagged by any monitoring services or any publicly known areas, so it did very well to basically hide this server the whole time. So after you get infected with the Ngioweb malware and you run it, this is where we'll move on to the DGA layer. So the DGA layer has around 15 active C2s at any given time, and each malware sample, depending on which version you're running, is going to generate somewhere between 100 to 1,000 different domains. And at the time of our disruption, there were around 10 different active DGA seeds in total, which accounted for over 7,000 domains the actor could have used at any time if they'd wanted. So once you start running the malware, you'll quickly run into the DGA layer. You'll start running through all the domains, trying to find one that's active. And once you find one that's active, you can receive a variety of different commands, but two of the most common commands that you'll start receiving are either a wait command, which will tell you how long to wait in seconds, or you'll get a connect command, which will tell you to connect to a back connect C2. What's really interesting, though, in this layer is the actors seem to go out of their way to make sure that their proxy service is only filled with proxies that they want, and they don't want it cluttered with anything that could potentially upset their users. So if you try to connect to this malware through Tor or through VPS or even some specific countries, they'll actually only receive wait commands, and you'll never actually receive the connect command, meaning they do a good amount of filtering to make sure their proxy service stays with only the proxies that they want. Then they go out of their way to make sure this DGA layer can never be fully taken over on a full-scale takedown. So the Ngioweb in newer samples uses DNS text records in order to prevent kind of full-scale proper sinkholing. So the malware is going to expect two text records, one that starts with key P and one that starts with V. So if you see in the screenshot at the bottom, there's two text records, one that starts with V and one that starts with P. So these values are going to be concatenated and then base 64 decoded, which is going to result in an MD5 with RSA encrypted blob. And the malware is then going to decrypt this, and it's going to contain the MD5 hash for the concatenated string of the domain name along with the IP address. So what this means is if you're a security researcher and you try to buy one of these domains because you want to monitor the botnet, or if you're going to try to sinkhole their whole botnet and move their domains to your IPs, it's not going to work. What's going to happen is basically you're going to move it. The victims are then going to realize that the P and V values no longer line up with the IP that it's on, and they're just going to pass right by that domain and will never actually respond to it. So this means a couple things. One, it's very hard to know the true scale of this botnet because you can't actually, the victims won't actually reply to you. And number two, you can't actually take over this botnet entirely and disinfect all the devices. You can still sinkhole all the domains such that you can basically make them all zombies and make them useless for the botnet, but you can't actually take them over unless you were to find the actor's private key. So moving on to our final layer, again, there was the wait and the connect command that you can receive in the DGA layer. So assuming you get the connect command, that'll be kind of this first step in order to pass you off to this back connect layer. Then once you get that connect command, the victim's going to reach out to the back connect C2, and the back connect C2 is going to reply with a GET request on a random looking URL that's actually hosted on the back connect C2 itself. Then the victim in the third image is going to reach out to that back connect C2 on that random looking URL, and it's going to receive a reply. If it receives a proper reply, it's going to say it works along with the actual IP of the victim. Assuming it gets that proper reply, it'll then send that back to the back connect C2. And assuming kind of this handshake all goes properly, this is likely the exact point in which you've officially been included into the NSOCKS proxy service. So the back connect C2s, however, don't stop collecting information there, though. So the first thing, if you remember when I was talking about the NSOCKS UI, I mentioned that they seem to include the victim DNS server, and they go out of their way in order to find it. And this is likely where that is occurring. So the victims will send a request, or the back connects will ask the victims to send a request to an arbitrary subdomain of either nslookups.com, dnsLookIPs.com, or IPcore DNS. And while we couldn't exactly understand the encrypted data that was being sent, what it likely is, based on the domain names and what we know about the UI, is this is where they're gathering what DNS server that the victims are using so they can then show their clients. Again, we're not exactly sure what the major value is, but they definitely go out of their way to get this value, and most proxy services don't at all include this, so they must find some value in it. The other thing that's interesting is these backconnect C2s all host a test.zip file, and the backconnect C2 will periodically request the bot to download this test.zip file, and we suspect this is mainly to evaluate the speed of the proxy, so they can then either charge a certain price point maybe based on it, or they can just show their users how fast these proxies work. So kind of understanding the whole architecture as a whole, we can now kind of look into what the actual proxy pipeline looks like. So the NSOCKS proxy architecture on the top image is how it's supposed to work. So basically the NSOCKS users would connect to these backconnect C2s. The backconnect C2s then connect to the NSOCKS bot, and then the bot will connect to the target. And then it'll go right back through that pipeline. However, these proxies have no form of authentication, so no username or password needed, and the backconnect C2s are generally robust. They don't rotate very much. So what we found was not only were NSOCKS users connecting to these backconnect C2s, but malware, specifically Agent Tesla and families like that, were connecting to these backconnect C2s to funnel traffic. Several DDoS actors were launching very large amounts of DDoS attacks in volume through these backconnect C2s. And we also saw several other proxy services were connecting into these backconnect C2s. So basically, while NSOCKS officially was only a proxy service, they were enabling way more malicious activity than either they had any idea they were doing, or they were more than happy to let all this malicious activity go. One specifically kind of really interesting thing that we saw was when we talk about other proxy services that were connecting to this. So when we think about the backconnect layer, we saw there was a Vietnamese proxy service, likely operating under two names, but with the same proxies in both of them. They were ShopSOCKS 5 and VN5 SOCKS. What they did was they actually built a multi-layered architecture on top of this backconnect C2 layer, and that all fed into a backend SQL database. So one of two things was either happening here. One is they had a direct reseller relationship with NSOCKS, where NSOCKS was directly allowing them to resell their IPs. Or what we think was more than likely happening is they were basically siphoning all of these layers off the Ngioweb and NSOCKS service, and then any successful proxies they could find, they would funnel into their backend database, and then they would sell these on their own service basically for free. We found out of the entire Ngioweb population, around 45% to 50% of it was also sold in ShopSOCKS 5 service, so they had quite a good amount. All right, on to hopefully the more exciting part. So as we kind of talked about, this architecture is nearly unkillable, and you can't go after any singular portion. You have to hit all of these at very similar times, or else they could easily rebuild too quick. So we had to figure out how to disrupt around 20 or so loader C2s that were active at any given time. We had to figure out how to disrupt the 15 active DGA C2s along with the other 7,000 domains that could be active at any time. And then we also had to figure out how we're going to disrupt the 180 or so backconnect C2 servers that were active. So in total, we had to figure out how we're going to disrupt 220 or so active IPs along with 7,000 domains. And I should specify that these IPs, for example, were in many different countries, many different ISPs and ASNs, and these domains were with many different registrars, so it's not like there was a singular entity we could go to kind of solve all of this. So we quickly realized that this was much too big for any kind of singular entity alone to be able to deal with. So we talked to a lot of different people. We talked to law enforcement. We talked to several other ISPs. We talked to a variety of other partners. We wanted to make sure that we were kind of covering all of our angles. So in our idea, the worst thing that could happen is we could either try to disrupt it and actually make it worse for the industry going forward, or we would try to disrupt it and there was maybe a backup mechanism we didn't know about, or there was some part of the architecture we hadn't been made aware of. So once we felt like we had a good idea and kind of what we're going to do for this, we kind of developed a clear approach by, one, having really clear communication channels for all of us sharing between law enforcement, private industry, different ISPs. We wanted everybody to be able to easily share information in and out and kind of not have any barriers there. And then we wanted to make sure everybody kind of knew the exact role they were going to be playing. We didn't want anybody to kind of be guessing or multiple people kind of focused on the same thing. So we came up with kind of this three-phased approach in order to take this down. So phase one was going to be Lumen, and kind of the ISP partners were going to null route all the IPs relating to the Ngioweb Botnet. So null routing, again, means we were basically going to drop the traffic such that nothing could communicate with it successfully. So this included the loader C2 layer, the back connect IP layers, and a lot of the active personal backend servers that we were able to find. Then, in phase two, Shadow Server and some other partners were going to focus on sinkholing all 7,000 of these Ngioweb domains from the active seeds that we were aware of. Then, with phase three, we're going to worry about abuse reporting to these ASNs in order to actually terminate all of these back connect C2s while they were being null routed simultaneously. So phase one and two were carried out at the exact same time, and then phase three was carried out very shortly after that. So when we first started this, we actually had no idea what we were expecting in terms of like, would the actor respond? How would we know if it was working? Would the service go down? So we just kind of waited around hoping we would hear something. And about 2 or 3 hours in, we finally got our first clue that it was working. On their Telegram channel, they said that their backend was under a massive DDoS attack and that the proxies were unstable. It's funny because they weren't being DDoSed, but they just hadn't figured that out yet. And then if you notice, it says 7,301. Their Telegram channel averaged around 5,000 to 6,000 users, so there was a fairly robust user base that was using this service. So about 10 to 12 hours in is when we finally got our first confirmation that they had indeed figured out most of what had happened, and they were not happy. So they sent a giant service interruption on their main page saying that competitors have hired an organization that has blocked their back connect servers and continues DDoS attacks. It's funny that they think a competitor hired us to do this. I don't even know what that means. And again, we weren't DDoSing them. And then also on Black Hat World, not only did they say, again, competitors hired us, but they also said that we used vile methods in order to interfere with their operations of their servers. In both of these, though, they mentioned that they understand what this null route is and what happened, but now they have to basically try to get their users to understand. So they're trying to tell them to change VPN servers, change location, if you're having a hard time running this. And this is likely what was so frustrating for NSOCKS and Ngioweb, whether you were the users or whether you were the actors, is because, so if we think about the pipeline again, how it worked, we had users connecting to the back connect C2s and the back connect C2s connecting to the bots. So multiple things had to occur properly in order to get around this null route. One, the bots had to have a successful path to these back connect C2s that avoided this null route activity. And then two, not only would the bots have to have a successful path, but you, the user, would also have to have a successful path. So you could buy a proxy and have no successful way in order to access it. And so you'd struggle basically saying like, hey, I bought this proxy, but it's offline. A lot of times in these services too, you don't just buy one proxy, maybe you'll buy 10 at once. And the way NSOCKS works is you could get 10 different back connect proxies. So if you can imagine buying 10 proxies and then trying to connect to all 10 of those, while simultaneously having to get around this basically null route we've created, is extremely difficult. So you would be buying these 10 proxies and maybe only one would work. And if you change a VPN, now 3 different ones work. So it was likely very frustrating, very confusing, and they didn't have an easy way to basically stop this from happening. So there was a lot of kind of blowback they were getting. And they were mad, and kind of rightfully so. Phase 1 and phase 2 were extremely successful overall. So phase 3 brought their back connect layer down from around 180 C2s down to around 60 C2s. And for the first month of our operation, we had them hovering around 15% of their pre-operation level. So on average, they averaged around 30 to 40,000 proxies. for the first month or so, they were only averaging around 2,000 to 3,000, depending on the given day. So they were definitely hurting. One side note is, I mentioned we only got down to 60 C2s. So not all of our abuse reports were properly handled or acted upon. So one interesting thing about the Ngioweb and NSOCKS is they don't use bulletproof hosters, likely because users are connecting in bots. They don't want to risk being automatically detected. So we assume that since they weren't using bulletproof hosters, most of these ASNs would be more than happy to cooperate with all the evidence that we had. However, we generally found two different issues seem to be occurring with some of these ASNs. One is they were just understaffed, and it was just very hard for them to properly act on this or properly understand the severity of it. And two, some just seemed to not fully utilize their skill set, maybe is the way to word it, where, example, in one case, I reached out to them and let them know basically all of the evidence that we had of why their C2s were part of this botnet and how to stop it. And basically, they then forwarded all of my information to the actor. And the actor then replied saying, everything I said is false and that they were actually undercover law enforcement working on an operation and they couldn't be disrupted. And the ASN said there's nothing they can do about that now. So we ran into issues like that, so we think that can definitely be improved in the future. What was fascinating, though, is when we took down NSOCKS, we expected like a ripple in ShopSOCKS 5 and VN5 SOCKS because we directly saw how they were connected to the back end. But we saw several other services take massive hits. TI SOCKS, which generally had around 5,000 or so proxies, barely had over 100 proxies remaining. SOCKS, which is a very popular Russian proxy service, generally had around 15,000 or so proxies. They barely had 1,000 proxies. After this, they also had a giant announcement on their page saying that they were affected by this November 18th attack that we did. And what's funny about all of these services is we never went after any of them. We only went after the Ngioweb Botnet, but this is how many of them were intertwined, and we're basically feeding off this same botnet. So about a month or two into our thing, one of our friends reached out to their support staff and wanted an update from them on why the service still wasn't working very well. And this is the reply that they received. They said that they were attacked by a terroristic organization known as Lumen Tech, and we hacked their servers, we hacked their computers, we DDoS their servers. We did none of this. Definitely didn't hack any of their servers or computers. And more importantly, we never went after NSOCKS again. We only went after the Ngioweb Botnet. This is just how intertwined these two services really were. We're taking down one, guarantees you take down the other. So they said this was an organized crime attack and that they received no legal action. They were gonna need a couple of months to fix things and change their website name. They said they were gonna move to a new website known as usocks5.com. And we monitored this for a very long time and it was never active until I checked a week ago, and it is officially online, and it is the exact same service as NSOCKS currently. You just, I guess, flip the U upside down. And so, but they're selling the exact same proxies currently, so it's just another reselling platform for them. So after 2 months, the actor was still fuming. The NSOCKS service was still operating at extremely low levels. They were around 20%, maybe 25% of their pre-operation levels, and this had been now 2 months or so. Users were still mad, so they were getting upset. They stopped replying on criminal forums entirely, at least under the name of NSOCKS, and they also stopped new signups for their service. So since our operation, no one has ever been allowed to sign up for their service again. So the actor got really mad and started trying a few new tactics that they hadn't previously tried. So the first was scare tactics and misinformation. So they actually sent us a cease and desist letter telling us basically that we need to remove any mentions of Ngioweb and NSOCKS together. We need to basically say how there is no connection. They wanted all of our data relating to any connection we had of them. And we obviously did not comply with this because we have ample proof that they indeed are one of the same, and they very much so feed off each other. So A couple of days went by, and we then received a massive DDoS attack against our blog, and another company who also called them out received the same DDoS attack. So we actually tracked this DDoS attack to being primarily launched from another popular Russian proxy service, and the attack lasted somewhere around 6 to 8 hours or so, and it was quite powerful. So after this, though, after this little outburst, if you will, they seem to have finally come to terms with kind of their new reality. So NSOCKS sent a message saying that they were going to start using a new type of proxy, and they admitted the quality is worse than it was, and proxies may change their IP during use. This was really confusing to us because we'd been monitoring for signs of the Ngioweb to come back to life, and we hadn't really seen any that it was fully back or even in operation. We were worried maybe we were missing something, maybe they somehow got around our detection, but it didn't really make sense why the quality would be worse or the proxy shouldn't be changing IPs. Again, if these were infected victims, the proxy shouldn't be changing IPs all that much. And then in their Telegram chat, they said they may implement a traffic usage limit. Again, that really made no sense to us. If these were the same proxies, why are you now implementing a traffic usage limit on them? And this is actually because these proxies are no longer part of the Ngioweb Botnet, and NSOCKS is no longer reliant on it. So NSOCKS has actually become an IP idea and a GeoNode reseller. So if you're unfamiliar in the proxy world, IP idea and GeoNode are two of the largest proxy services currently in the world. Both have millions of proxies, basically in any location you could ever want. So if you can see in the top image, if you recall that I mentioned at the beginning, NSOCKS generally had around 30 to 40,000 proxies at any given time. Currently, their totals, on average, come close to doubling that on any given day, which is a clear sign that, again, if they were using the same population, they shouldn't have double the amount of proxies. And the proxy pipeline is actually no longer using the Ngioweb botnet. So around 80% of these bots can currently be tied back to one of these two proxy services, either IP idea or GeoNode. And if you actually look through kind of the data that we have in the net flow, we can actually see the true connection pipeline now, which is basically the NSOCKS user is connecting to the backconnect C2. These backconnect C2s, instead of reaching out to NSOCKS bots, are now reaching out to GeoNode and IP idea entry points, which is then forwarding to the actual GeoNode and IP idea proxy, which will then go to the target and kind of come back through that same pipeline. So they've completely gone away from the Ngioweb botnet since it's still down. So just a couple final thoughts. One is that the proxy world has a ton of overlap. So if you remember, when we took down the Ngioweb botnet, several services went down with it, which shows how many were overlapping. But not only that, is once the Ngioweb went down, services like NSOCKS and others, they just bounced to another proxy service. So the idea is trying to get them away from the botnet related ones and get them to more either benign ones or get them to ones that we can keep kind of disrupting. Overall, this operation as a whole was pretty successful. The Ngioweb botnet, as I'd mentioned, had been around likely since we think around 2015, and multiple services were relying on it. And not only were services relying on it, but DDoS actors and other malware were also using it. So we did good in terms of slowing it down. And then we turned multiple proxy services that were relying on it into merely resellers of others. So we keep kind of pushing them kind of into a corner. And the final thing is collaboration with other private industry partners and law enforcement works, and it can work really well, especially on botnets of large scale like this. So kind of the main things that we learned from that were, one is having a very clear goal with open communication. So you need to be able to share with each other what exactly you're doing, when you're thinking. You need to be able to align timelines. The next is ensure you talk through your strategy entirely. In our opinion, the worst thing that could have happened is we could have completely missed a backup mechanism or some portion of this botnet, or because we were trying to be the first to say something, or because we were trying to be too secretive, we could have missed something that would have allowed them to basically rebuild in a day or rebuild in a couple days. And the final is decide where private industry can be of best use and where law enforcement can be of best use. So especially in botnets that are in many different countries, in many different registrars, some may be more friendly, some may be not as friendly. It's important to understand maybe where ISPs can help through null routing, where maybe companies can help through blocking or security monitoring, where law enforcement can help through action. There's a really nice niche, kind of everyone can play in these kind of really wide, large-scale takedowns. So we think we can definitely kind of improve and hopefully disrupt several more similar to this kind of over the years. And then, yeah, if there's any questions.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple of questions. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. Quick question about the communication part and the phase takedown. How many partners and ISP did you have to communicate with, and what type of communication channel did you use to communicate all the IOC and all the IP and phase to go through?
Yeah, so so in terms of ISPs, so we communicate with a fair amount of ISPs, and then given the exact operation, maybe not all will participate in stuff, so I can't say an exact amount, but it's several, I'll say, and it's enough to where it would be very hard to, no matter where you're coming from, any country, any location, it would be very hard to not have to completely move your architecture to get around it. It would basically take down it would basically take any architecture offline. And then what was the second part?
And the second part was what type of communication channel did you use to communicate with?
Yeah, so a variety of different, Slack, Keybase, and Signal, depending on certain. So all of us had to use a couple of different ones. But yeah, I'd say Keybase was probably a big one for this.
Okay, is there a second question?
Do you think that this has any added benefit of kind of sowing discord amongst actor groups, and did you notice any of that? Because you mentioned that one actor group said that, you know, our enemies or whatever, our competitors are are doing this on purpose.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it sows it against different groups. That's kind of the goal, is that especially with them not being able to fully explain why their service wasn't working, is that people will kind of hop around, people will leave, people will go to different places. So that's generally the goal, is since, as I mentioned, you couldn't fully take this entire thing over and disinfect everybody, you not only want to disrupt it entirely, but also basically get people to worry that this no longer works how I want it, just go away entirely.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, last question. One, two, three. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh.